But I was hoping to welcome our new year on a happier note. Doesn't it seem like we were just starting to come out of our shells? We were booking vacations. We started working out again. We shopped inside, right? My wife and I, and the parents in the room, I appreciate this. My wife and I, for just a few weeks, even thought we might not have to send our kids to school wearing masks. How we can laugh at that. It felt like a new beginning was upon us. But then, in a way that we should have seen coming, given the track record of the past few years, our hopeful expectations were dashed, and here we are, hoping for a good year, and knowing that just a normal year would suffice. Because with Delta now spreading across the country, we have another bad ending to another bad year. And it's a shame, because after all we went through this past year, you really did deserve a happier ending. Endings count. Endings count, which is why I'm so captured by a psychological study appropriately titled, "When More Pain is Preferred to Less." In 2 different experiments, subjects had to keep their hands in very cold water, one time for 60 seconds, and the other for 60 seconds, followed by an additional 30 seconds where the water temperature was turned up just a little bit. Still very cold water. When asked which experiment subjects would like to repeat, interestingly, almost everyone chose the 90 seconds. Still cold water, but 50% more time, because the ending was just a little bit better. All's well that ends well, I guess, and sadly, as we celebrate Rosh HaShanah this year in the shadow of an ongoing pandemic, the opposite is also true. I can't help but think about endings as we look back on this emotional roller coaster of a year. And today, I can't help but think about endings as we study one of the Bible's greatest emotional roller coasters, the 19 verses that tell the story of the binding of Isaac. After decades of prayer, Abraham and his beloved wife Sarah finally have a child who they name Isaac, meaning laughter. But their joy did not last long. Sometime afterward, our Torah reads, God put Abraham to the test, and God said, "Take your son Isaac, whom you love." We know what happens next. Abraham and Isaac ascend the mountain. An angel stays Abraham's hand before he can do the unthinkable. And skipping ahead, Abraham is rewarded handsomely for his, I'm not even sure what it is. God declares, "Because you, Abraham, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessings upon you. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the heavens and the sands on the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command." Abraham, in verses 17 and 18, passes God's test with flying colors, and he's rewarded beyond his wildest imagination. But these are only verses 17 and 18. And because endings count, let's read verse 19, where the Akedah actually ends. Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Why does the Akedah end? Not with Abraham's reward in 17 and 18, but with Beersheba, where our patriarch went after the test was over. You know, when our all-star team at Washington Hebrew, all-star softball team, wins yet another championship game, this year is their 7th, Mazel Tov, everyone takes pictures and celebrations abound. But so far as I know, the Washington Jewish Week is wholly uninterested in capturing our players pulling into their driveways after the game. Where they go after the victory is just not newsworthy. So why does the Akedah end with Abraham staying in Beersheba when it could have ended the verses earlier with Abraham's triumphant victory? It's not like Beersheba is anywhere to write home about either. And for those of you who may not know, Beersheba is a sleepy little town in the Negev. Has anybody been? About 3 people here. Okay. Besides a few restaurants, a shopping mall, and an Ottoman church, I don't think anything's changed in Beersheba since Abraham first visited after the Akedah. So why does the Akedah end in this sleepy little desert town, Beersheba, and not with the glory of the verses before? The Akedah is a moment of confrontation, and it ends in tragic distance between people who used to be close. As many other rabbis have commented, no one talks to each other after this horrible story concludes. Abraham spent the first part of his life close with his beloved wife Sarah, his dear son Isaac, close to God. But after this crucible, no one's on speaking terms again. Abraham and Sarah, Abraham and Isaac, Isaac and Sarah, even Abraham and God, the closeness that once defined them is gone. So why does this story of distance end with Beersheba? Why doesn't it end with the glory of the verses before? I wonder if it has something to do with the name, Beersheba. For native Hebrew speakers, Beersheba means literally 7 wells. The Akedah ends in a place with wells. Wells in the desert. It's quite an image, actually. Because in this Lawrence of Arabia landscape, known for its sand dunes and its tumbleweeds, these 7 wells of Beersheba affirm that under the layers of sand and silt and mud and rock is life-giving water. There's something profound, maybe holy, under the surface. And in this time of such distance, we need the Akedah's message now more than ever. Because we live in an age where life-saving measures only work when we keep our distance from each other. We are back in an era that will be remembered for its Zoom meetings, where people are reduced to tiny little boxes on a screen and are invariably muted or unmuted when they should not be. So, in a time when we are not together, in a time marked by separation, how can we connect to each other again? While this pandemic has made it all worse, you've probably felt this distance long before COVID. We felt this distance bubbling to the surface time and again as the partisan chaos in our country continues to find its focal point in Washington, D.C. Whether it's the far right or the far left or racial reckoning or gender discrimination or Israel or a surge in anti-Semitism, loud voices find their megaphone right here. We can't help but hear them, and they are pulling us apart. We, God's children, are distant from each other, so painfully distant, more distant than we've been in a very long time. Or maybe the distance you feel is personal. A few weeks ago at a Friday night sermon, I quoted a study mentioned in an op-ed by David Brooks, and it haunts me to this day. 1 in 4 Americans has completely severed ties with a close family member or friend. And more shocking, still, nearly half of our country, 47%, is considering following suit. Has life always been this way? Have we always been so distant? How can we find closeness after so much time traveling apart from the very people we used to love? Or to put this into biblical language, what do we do when the wells are now covered and we see nothing but sand? I wonder if this is Isaac's question as he forges his life beyond the Akedah. Isaac, our second patriarch, famously does not do very much, at least compared to the other two patriarchs, Abraham and Jacob. Abraham, as you know, launches the Jewish story. He fights wars. He even argues with God. Jacob outmaneuvers his murderous brother Esau. He wrestles with an angel. And as the father of 12 tribes, becomes our people's very namesake, Yisrael. Two excellent patriarchal resumes, if you ask me. But Isaac, what does Isaac do? Isaac is the only patriarch who never leaves the promised land. Isaac marries, has children, grows old, and when the time comes, passes away. Compared to the escapades of Abraham and Jacob, it'd be a tall order to write Isaac's biography. But Isaac surprisingly does one thing. After his father Abraham dies, the wells Abraham dug were filled with earth. Isaac, our Torah teaches, dug anew the wells. Isaac is our patriarch who redigs wells. You cannot talk about wells without talking about faith. And so I want to talk about faith for just a moment. Abraham had faith in God's justice, famously challenging the Almighty, declaring, "Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" That's Abraham's faith. For Jacob, he had faith in God's providence. If God remains with me, Jacob says, protects me, and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, Adonai shall be my God. And of all that you give me, I will set aside a tithe. That's Jacob's faith. But nowhere does our Torah say what Isaac believed about God. So what was Isaac's faith? Look to the wells. Isaac knew that there was something buried underneath, even in Abraham, even in people who had hurt him deeply. Isaac had a different faith, a faith in God's children, a faith that after the Akedah led Isaac to redig even his father's wells. Isaac had faith that there was something sacred under the sand. What a gift Isaac gave to his late father Abraham. And what a gift Isaac gives to us as inheritors of his spiritual legacy. You see, Isaac does not run away from Abraham's memory, though he could have. He does not try to cover his pain even more. Instead, Isaac believed that there could be something buried under layers of pain and strife, and devoted his life to finding it. Isaac's faith was not just in God. Isaac's faith was in you and me. And after everything we've been through, Isaac had faith in our ability to see the sacred in each other once again. Maybe this is why there are two endings to the Akedah. Verses 17 and 18 celebrating the honor and the glory and Abraham's exaltation before God. And verse 19 affirming that the story ends with Beersheba, a place of wells to be dug and, when necessary, dug again. The real ending of the Akedah teaches us that even after distance, closeness is possible. This doesn't mean that we must subject ourselves to more disappointment, more grief, more pain, but that until we can see something more than disappointment, more than grief, more than pain in each other, our story is not over. Our story is not over yet. Rosh HaShanah affirms that underneath the seemingly impenetrable layers that separate us as a nation, behind the masks and the distance and the Democrats and Republicans and black and white and men and women and parents and children and anger and pain and distance, so much painful distance, is the possibility of closeness once again. You see, the Akedah ends with Beersheba. a place with water underneath the rock. And where we cannot see it, Isaac places a shovel in our hands and says, it's down there. I have faith. Start digging. What would the new year look like? What would it feel like if we had just a little of Isaac's faith in each other once again? In an age marked by separation and cynicism, what if we believed in people again? What if there was water under the rock? And what if we, like Isaac, devoted ourselves in this new year to finding it? We Jews have endured worse years than this. We have experienced pain beyond imagination. But even in moments of our greatest darkness, we have held fast to our faith, not just in God, but in God's children. And it is our faith in each other that has driven us to write even new chapters of hope and healing after the world has conspired to take them away. As Anne Frank, all of 14 years old, famously wrote in her diary while hiding away in an attic from the very people who sought to take her life, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see a world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder which will destroy us too. I can feel the sufferings of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think that it will come right, that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. Peace and tranquility can return again. This is the faith of the Akedah, the promise of Beersheba, our hope that a story of distance can end in a place of life-saving wells. This is the faith of our patriarch Isaac, who devotes his life to redigging them. And this is our faith today. Because to be a Jew is to long for closeness, no matter how distant we've become. To be a Jew is to have faith in a better ending. Our new year affirms that the book of life has yet more space. There is more to write than has already been written. Your book of life is open today, and your story does not have to end with distance. The wells might be covered for years or even decades, but not forever. Healing is possible. This is our faith. And when our time comes, when our book of life draws to a close, there is only one question that matters. How do you want your story to end? How do you want your story to end? May life's story end with closeness. May it end with love. Let's start digging. Shana tova umituka. May this be a good and a sweet and a closer year. Shana tova.
Beautiful. With that message of hope and excitement for